Welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. This is Craig Truglia, and today we're going to be talking about the papacy's infallibility problem. It's a system that's broken, and we'll get into detail about that today. Our summary for today is that the Roman Catholic doctrine of the papacy, as it pertains to papal infallibility, does not adequately clarify doctrine. Roman Catholics don't agree whether the term define is the magic word in alleged ex cathedra statement, and Roman Catholicism has not definitively settled what causes death, which is a pretty basic and important Christian teaching. Now, this sounds almost too crazy to be true, but this is very true and really not talked about by popular apologetics, and it requires more attention to be paid. Now, before we get started, and that's getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, I just want to remind people to please support the mission work in Cambodia. We have PayPal link below. We have Venmo below, if that's more your thing. And also, we have even Patreon if you want to be a monthly contributor. PayPal is preferred. It has the least tax consequences, which means then more money by default, because 100% of what is donated goes to Cambodia. So more bang for your buck through PayPal, but all links are below to support the mission work in Cambodia. The big thing we really want to do different this year is to translate the lives of the saints and have a whole year's worth of saints for Cambodian language readers. And for $10, we translate Life of Saint. So please, if this video blesses you, go to orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate or the PayPal and other links below, and please support the mission work in Cambodia. That'd be much appreciated and help support me to have the motivation to take the time out of my day to do these apologetic videos, because my heart really is behind this Cambodian mission. That's what motivates me. So let's get going. Now we have this issue, which I think is very basic. What really is ex cathedra to Roman Catholics? Well, canonically for the Roman Catholic Church, infallible decrees are limited in scope. All right, so we want to give the definition that is actually given by Roman Catholics, and that is in their canon law, as cited here, no doctrine is understood to be infallibly defined unless it is clearly established as such. So it has to very specifically say it's infallibly defined, but it's not infallibly defined what the magic words are. So, like, for example, it'd be very useful if it started with infallibility starts now, and now it ends, so you know what it is. But this has never been infallibly decreed, so we have quite a bit of division on this question. In fact, this created kind of a scuffle between two Roman Catholic apologists, Jimmy Akin and Christian Wagner. And I'm going to share a clip there after just answering a quick question. Did that earthquake affect Cambodia? It did not. It only affected Burma and Thailand. And believe it or not, all the churches in Thailand are fined. I was told that specifically, thank God. So there's no problems. We're not raising any money for donations for the churches there. They're all fine. I'm sure there's people that do need help. And this is Lent. This is a season for almsgiving. Consider that whatever your heart moves you. But thank God the Orthodox churches are fine in Southeast Asia. So we're going to very quickly share a clip from Jimmy Akin where we're going to have a good summary of what Roman Catholics understand is infallible. So I'm trying to add the stage. 1 second. This video. Here we are. And we're going to get started.
First, here he argues that it was infallibly defined by Blessed Pope Pius IX, and he bases this on the passage in the 1854 Apostolic Constitution Ineffabilis Deus that says,
the statement from Ineffabilis Deus, it says, from the very beginning and before time began, the eternal Father chose and prepared for his only begotten Son, a mother in whom the Son of God would become incarnate, and from whom in the blessed fullness of time he would be born into this world. Above all creatures did God so loved her, that truly in her was the Father well pleased with singular delight. Therefore, far above all the angels and all the saints, so wondrously did God endow her with the abundance of all heavenly gifts, poured from the treasury of his divinity, that this mother, ever absolutely free from all stain of sin, all fair and perfect, would possess that fullness of holy innocence and sanctity, that which under God one cannot even imagine anything greater, and which outside of God no mind can succeed in comprehending fully. Well, yeah, I guess that's not defining in this ex cathedra definition that she was free from venial sin. Like, what the heck? How else are you going to read this? I literally have no idea how else one would read this.
Christian, this is why you need to learn more before you start weighing in on issues like this, because if you knew more, you would have an idea how else this could be read. In fact, you would know how it should be read. There is no question that Pius IX is teaching in this passage that Mary was absolutely sinless throughout her life. He says that she was, quote, always and absolutely free from every strain of sin, close quote. The question is whether he is teaching that by a definitive act, in the words of the Code of Canon Law, and the answer is no. You can't just read a document that contains an infallible definition and conclude that everything in the document is infallible. The only parts of the document that are definitive are the parts where a pope uses language indicating definitiveness, which in this case is where the pope uses the verb define. Thus, the definitive part of the document is found later on, where the pope says, we declare, pronounce, and define that the doctrine that maintains that the most blessed Virgin Mary, at the first instant of her conception, by the singular grace and privilege of Almighty God, and in view of the merits of Jesus Christ, the Savior of the human race, was preserved immune from all stain of original sin, is revealed by God. As competent theologians universally agree, the only statement in Ineffabilis Deus that is taught under infallibility is the one where Pius XI defines the Immaculate Conception. Nothing else in the document is definitive, and so nothing else in the document is infallible. This is the standard understanding of all competent theologians, and it isn't just theologians who hold that. On June 12, 1996, Pope St. John Paul II gave a general audience in which he noted things that were part of the document but were not infallibly defined. For example, he stated, the text of the dogmatic definition does not expressly declare that Mary was redeemed, but in the same bull, Ineffabilis states elsewhere that she was redeemed in the most sublime way. John Paul II thus distinguishes between what is contained in the dogmatic definition and what is written elsewhere in the document. The fact Mary is immaculately conceived is in the definition. The fact that she is redeemed is not. And it's only the dogmatic definition that is dogmatically defined. You thus can't lift a statement from elsewhere in the document, like the teaching that Mary remained free from sin after her conception, and shove it into the definition. As Pope St. John Paul II went on to say in his audience the next week, the definition of the dogma of the Immaculate Conception directly concerns only the first moment of Mary's existence, from when she was preserved free from every stain of original sin. The ongoing sinlessness of Mary thus flows from her Immaculate Conception, but it is not part of the definition itself. That's why you don't find competent people citing Ineffabilis Deus as infallibly defining this teaching. They do cite it as supporting the teaching, and it does, but it doesn't infallibly define the teaching.
Oh, right. So we see that now. It doesn't infallibly define the teaching. And this is something that shows, we see from Jimmy Akin, that infallibility starts with the words I define, and then it ends essentially when I guess the sentence is over or something like that. It is only the dogmatic definition that is dogmatically defined. That's papal infallibility according to Jimmy Akin. And for what it's worth, it does appear he's correct, right? Pope John Paul II appears to be clearly following this sort of model that he's inferring. But it is worth pointing out that this is a uselessly narrow definition, because when we listen to papal apologetics, go, look at this letter from, Pope Agatha, look at this letter from Pope Adrian II, et cetera, and Adrian I, or whatever, and they'll say, look, the Orthodox accepted papal infallibility, but if you read those letters, it doesn't say I define or I decree any of those papal doctrines. So by their own standard, these would be fallible statements, which could not demand the adherence of the listeners. This is a point that Dositheus II makes, by the way, in interpreting the Council of Nicaea II. He points out, because he takes for granted that the issues about the ecumenical patriarch are actually authentic to the letters of Pope Adrian I. I don't agree with this, but be that as it may, presuming that the audience here did actually hear these things, he says, well, clearly they didn't accept all that papal stuff in the letters, because the council then continued calling the ecumenical patriarch. So that means they disregarded the papalist passages in those letters, which is a very interesting way to turn that whole argument against them. I don't think he's textually correct, but it actually makes these whole, you accepted this stuff about Pope Agatha or Pope Adrian on the papacy, it actually turns into this self-eviscerating polemic. So hand that to Dositheus II. But that being said, it's just uselessly narrow. Then, like, we don't know anything that's infallible because no one spoke that way generally in the first millennium church. So that being said, though, that doesn't mean we don't have anything in the first millennium church. It actually uses the language that Jimmy Atkins talks about. In fact, what he now does is open a terrible can of worms for the Roman Catholic side. Now, I'm going to be quoting Pope Vigilius. This is the first Constitutum, and the citations below. Pope Vigilius actually defines something. What's he define here? He says, all this we investigated with care, and that our fathers, albeit in varying modes of expression, yet discoursing with a single current of understanding, preserved unharmed the persons of priests who had died in the peace of the church. And that, as we said above, the same was defined canonically by decrees of the Apostolic See, namely that no one is permitted to pronounce any new judgment on the persons of the deceased, but they are to be left exactly as the last day found each one. Or in short, defined that you cannot anathematize people after death, right? That's the point here in the first Constitutum. But we could see that Pope Vigilius later changes on this. So in his letter to Eutyches, he writes, but because Christ our God, who is the true light that the darkness does not comprehend, has removed all confusion from our mind and recalled the universal church to peace, with the result that through the Lord's revelation and the investigation of the truth, what needed to be defined by us has been savingly accomplished. And then what follows is him affirming the ecumenical councils and condemning the 3 chapters, anathematizing the people. And so, of course, the real Cope apologetic is going to be, he's defining here that the 4 ecumenical councils are true, which, come on, we know that's not the case. They didn't bring together the 5th council and demand the Pope to accept the 5th council by defining he accepts the 4 previous councils. I mean, that's just silly. Context would inveigh against that. But here's the smoking gun in the second Constitutum, because he defines the exact opposite of what he defined in the first Constitutum. Pope Vigilius writes, we believe it to be utterly necessary for preserving respect for, in all regards, that on questions recorded above concerning the 3 chapters, we should discuss everything and define it by the careful promulgation of a verdict. We therefore deem it appropriate first, as we propose, to make clear by explicit proof what judgment should be pronounced on the letter that is said to be written by Ebus to Mari the Persian. And what follows in this letter is condemnation of Ebus, and essentially what we see here, he has defined that now we could anathematize these people. Right? So the exact opposite of what he wrote in the first Constitutum. And so what we see here is that the papal infallibility defined in the Pre-Schism, is that occurring? No. First Millennium Church lacks any decrees or definitions from a pope about the papacy, which Roman Catholic apologists employ polemically. So, right, they don't follow the Jimmy Akin rule here. They just follow the rule Michael Kay talks about. It's infallible when it's infallible, right? So it's infallible when it suits their purposes. It doesn't follow any rule. But the problem with that is that when Pope Vigilius defined that the church does not have the authority to anathematize after death, he then defined later that the opposite by anathematizing people after death by definition, because he said, this is what I define. So to me, this is like unworkable problem. And they're going to just say, well, this is not a matter of faith and morals. So he said, he said the magic words, but he invalidated it by doing something that's disciplinary, not in faith and morals. But one would think that the capacity of the church to anathematize is not a mere discipline. It's a prerogative of the church, just like the prerogative of the church to discipline people in general. If that's not a matter of the faith, then why is it mentioned in Matthew chapter 18? Why is it a matter of people's eternal salvation? So again, as we see here, it's simple, it's infallible when it's infallible, right? Like when they want it to be. And so that being said, what if Jimmy Akin is wrong, right? I have to admit, it's not the popular explanation we hear about papal infallibility. Obviously, it seems that Christian Wagner never heard of this in his life, even though it sounds like Roman Catholic theologians are aware of this. But what if he's wrong? Because it's not infallibly defined. Well, it's definitely better for Roman Catholic apologetics that Jimmy Akin's wrong, right? Especially for apologetics against the Orthodox, because that way they could pull at these broader papal statements and when they need to say, well, they're infallible and you must accept them, and people accept them as infallible and that is fallible statements, etc. So it works better for them. But it does lead to this fundamentalist reading of ex cathedra statements, where just whatever was written in the whole statement now becomes what's binding. And I'm not even saying that's bad, but now it sort of demands, all right, so if we understand what is defined within the whole decree of a ex cathedra statement, right, because context should determine what that definition means, then what's so crazy about the Orthodox way of looking at the entirety of the minutes of ecumenical council to understand the context of the conciliar decree? Right now, it's not crazy anymore. It's not conciliar fundamentalism or whatever derogatory term you want to use. Now it's sensible. So this broader reading of a papal ex cathedra statement that one could take if Jimmy Akin and all the capable Roman Catholic theologians, I suppose, are wrong, only shows that the Orthodox way of doing things is correct. And in fact, the idea that the Roman Catholic narrow version of infallibility makes it harder for them polemically and less workable for them polemically kind of magnifies that the Orthodox contextual view is more workable and more sensible, right? We have a magisterium that works, while, as we're going to see, the Roman Catholics have a magisterium that does not work, that is broken, which is why the thumbnail says broken, right? They have no infallible list of ex cathedra decrees. We don't know what within those decrees is actually infallible. We don't know when infallibility starts or ends. This is a broken system that does not work, that leads to epistemic doubt, that does not settle things. And my challenge to Roman Catholic apologists is to show me, how's this not true? Point to me to your infallible list ex cathedra decrees. Point to me, how do we know where it starts or ends? These infallible definitions. I define, is it just one sentence? Does it end at a comma or a semicolon? When does it end? This is very important if this sort of very specific and peculiar power of a pope to infallibly decree something's actually important and not just something arbitrary that's made up and arbitrarily interpreted. So this is something very important, but they don't really have a good answer for this. And so I don't expect one to give me a good answer. Now, we got a few audience comments. When I asked Roman Catholics about how many infallible statements they think they have, they can't give me an answer. It's kind of like infallible lists, infallible books from Protestants. And so we have this, the idea that an office can magically render a man infallible, even within some narrow limit criteria, completely destroys any properly Christian understanding of human anthropology and spirituality. All right. So now we'll keep going. Here is a very obvious and important thing, which should be, I would say, being that's historically certain, because we have a tomb for Mary, accepted without any sort of division or debate after 2,000 years of history. Did Mary die? Right? Very obvious thing. But in Roman Catholicism, they can't settle things, right? The accusation is Orthodox can't settle important questions. Well, here's a very important, very central question that is not settled in Roman Catholicism. Did Mary die? Well, it depends on who you ask. So this is the Notre Dame Journal, Church Life Journal, with a little brief comment on that question. Although many of the fathers and doctors of the church have taught that Mary died and was raised from the dead before being assumed into heaven, a number of 20th century theologians argue that Mary never died, but was transferred from earth to a heavenly existence without undergoing death. Pope Pius XII was very careful in his formulation the dogmatic formula to say at the end of her earthly life rather than at her death, to leave open the possibility that Mary never died. All right. Again, depends on who you ask. What's Catholic.com say? Did Mary experience bodily death? Answer, yes. It is the common teaching, the ordinary magisterium of the church and in its liturgical worship that Our Lady underwent bodily death. All right, so we are not sure, it's debatable, it's left open on purpose. Now we have the answer, yes, it was. Then we have CatholicCourier.com say, did Mary die as we know death? That question has prompted theological speculation for centuries, and the church has never answered it definitively. Some theologians feel that since death is a consequence of sin, Mary would not have had to die. You keep going, because it depends on who you ask. We have this, a quotation from someone in the same journal article in Church Life Journal. Since she is the mother of God as a person through her body by which she bore Jesus in her womb, death would be the revoking of that material relation for an interval of time. She would no longer be the mother of God, but the soul of one who was the mother of God. She would no longer have that blessed relation if she were to cease being a person. So here we have this Roman Catholic argument in modern times that Mary did not die. Now, in the actual definition for the Assumption of Mary, in its 20th paragraph, but not in its definition as Jemmy Akin would put it, it refers to the Theotokos death. Now, that being said, we see that Fathers Wegner and Yugi were Marian Immortalists. These two priests were working with the Pope at that time when he was coming up with the Assumption document. Now, just by the way, not that he's alive at the time, Father Christian Copps is also a Marian Immortalist. So that being said, to quote Schumacher, at the urging of Yugi in particular, the 1950 definition deliberately left open the question of the Virgin's actual death. So let that sink in. This issue wasn't put the rest in the definition. It was deliberately left open because the person helping writing it didn't believe she died. You see, so it's deliberately unsettled. The papal infallibility machine was not able to settle this all-important question. And it's not a mere historical curiosity. We're going to unpack this. Now, let's look at the 5th paragraph of the Assumption document. It says, now God has willed that the Blessed Virgin Mary should be exempted from this general rule, that's death. She, by an entirely unique privilege, completely overcame sin by her immaculate conception. And as a result, she was not subject to the law of remaining in the corruption of the grave. Right? So why did she not die? Because of her immaculate conception. Right? So this is the sort of theological idea that's put forth in the Assumption document, despite it observing later in paragraph 20 that she did die. Because she overcame sin, she was not subject to the law of death. So how do we interpret paragraph 5? Well, it depends whether you're a Marian Immortalist Roman Catholic or a Marian Mortalist Roman Catholic, because this is not a settled issue for them. They can't settle these important questions. Now, the Marian Immortalist view is that the Immaculate Conception prevented her death and corruption, right? That's why. And so then her death would have to be voluntary. So it's kind of simple, right? She's immortal. If she died, it would have to be voluntary because her death was prevented because she had no sin. It couldn't happen. Now, the Mortalist view is that the Immaculate Conception prevented the death of her soul, but not her body, right? But not her body. Her soul was rendered immortal, but not her body. But the Mortalist view is flagrantly dualist. It suggests God infuses sin into the massa damnata, and it allows abortion. This sounds crazy. I'm not really trying to slander the Roman Catholics. We're going to now go read something from Bishop Olathorn, who wrote the Immaculate Conception after attending the 1854 definition of the Immaculate Conception. So this is what a contemporary understands, and this is a contemporary defending the mortalist view. He's not a Marian immortalist because they existed at the time as well. So what does Bishop Olathorn say? Because we're going to see that what he teaches leads to abortion. It's Gnostically dualist, and this makes it very problematic. So he writes, the body is transmitted through the parents. The soul is infused by God, right? So God, I suppose, could infuse all of our souls without sin, but he did that just for Mary, right? The transmission of the body, whereby we are of the one body of Adam, is called by the divines the active conception. The infusion of the soul, whereby the body receives its animation, is called the passive conception. The distinction between these two conceptions was not scientifically drawn at the period anterior to St. Thomas and St. Bonaventure. And the one of the distinction at an earlier period explains the seeming contradiction. So we could see Mary could not help but inherit actively. She was conceived with the sin of Adam, right? Her body was actively conceived in sin, but passively, she was conceived without sin. God infused her soul without sin. Right? Apparently just for Mary. Doesn't do that for anyone else just because. So let's continue. Bishop Olathorn says on the next page, science has not been able to fix the period of animation, but at whatever time it may place, it is certain that the body is an organized ere the soul is infused, or when the soul is infused. For the infusion of the soul from God is consequent on the transmission of body. It cannot be identical with the act with its causes. Now, he's going to get much more specific. There's a pretty decent period of time between the infusion of the soul and the body. So the conception of the soul, the passive conception, occurs considerably after the conception, the active conception of the body, which again, not that Olathorn ever says this, but it does lead to the question, is it murder to kill a body without a soul? Well, let's continue with Bishop Olathorn. We must further observe, as very for understanding the subject, that the body, before it has received the animating soul, is not the subject, but only the cause of sin. Deriving from its origin the poison of concupiscence, the soul created and infused without grace, to which, as a child Adam, it has lost all claim, becomes overwhelmed in the body's disorder, subjected to its blind confusion, and distorted from rectitude until by the grace. So I just want to say very quickly, what Olathorn's essentially saying here is that without baptism or without the Immaculate Conception, when you're born, your soul is infused. It's not really defective, but it's not really full of grace either. It's just this neutral, but the body is not neutral. The body is sinful, and that distorts the soul. That the body distorts the soul. We're going to find out that's putting the cart in front of the horse. And that's why he says, well, essentially, that's why those who aren't baptized have these distorted souls and they could be damned, essentially. But that being said, he continues. Separating then these two periods of time, whatever may be the distance between them, the question regards not the embryo, which is not humanity. It regards not the embryo, which is not humanity, which has no personality, and which is incapable of spiritual grace, right? Because it doesn't have a soul yet. It's not human. That's why, by the way, eunomianism is a Christological heresy, the idea that Christ can have a soul. So he's arguing here the embryo is not human. That is the argument here, right? So we'll continue. The question regards the moment of rational animation of the reception, or more truly, of the conception of the soul and the instant of its union with the body, right? So that's why he's arguing for this Marian mortalist view, that she could die because she could be immaculately conceived according to her soul, just not her body. So not me putting words in anyone's mouth. This is right here. He believes the Immaculate Conception allowed Mary's body to die because this was inherited as sinful and disordered, but her soul was infused with grace as it was sinless, so that its energies, that's a quote from Olathorn, were not disordered by the sinful body's energies. All right? So that is, you have literally the body working against the soul. In Mary, in this case, it's like I said, it's flagrantly Gnostically dualist. He then quotes Pope Alexander VII, who this pope quotes a bunch of other popes, into essentially agreeing with his categories of thought here. And this is a big issue, as we see. If we can make these different categories of thought, where the word conception doesn't mean one thing, it can mean any number of things. As a result, it doesn't matter what you define, you could endlessly categorize anything that's defined and say, well, this is defined this category, even though it didn't mention the category, and not that category, right? Which again leads to this ability that this whole papal magisterial system cannot settle a question ever. There is an endless regress of possible definitions and clarifications as it pertains to categorizations. This is a very serious epistemic problem. Again, no one talks about it. Everyone's like, I need to feel epistemic certainty. But just by the way it's designed, Roman Catholicism can never give you epistemic certainty because it can never give you a final categorization of thoughts. And it hasn't defined where in a definition it's infallible to begin with. So you really don't know. Now, to try to expound and give you this idea, not expound, but kind of clarify and give you this idea of what the mortalist view of original sin is, let's look at Pope Alexander VII's Constitutum. He wrote, "It is the ancient and pious belief of the faithful of Christ towards the most blessed Mother, the Virgin Mary, that her soul, at the first instant of its creation and infusion into the body, was by the especial grace and privilege of God, in view of the merits of Jesus Christ, her Son, the Redeemer of the human race, preserved and made exempt from the stain of original sin. And it is in this sense that they honor and celebrate with solemn rite the festival of her conception." Right? It was her soul that had the grace and privilege of God, not necessarily the body. If you go, well, I don't take that inference, here's quoting Pope Alexander VII later in the same Constitutum, where he's making clear that this is exactly the inference we're supposed to draw. "The soul of the Blessed Virgin at its creation and infusion into the body was endowed with the grace of the Holy Ghost preserved from original sin." Right? So he's saying the soul is what was preserved from original sin. He is not saying this is true of the body. Now, Bishop Olathorn continues later in the same book, The Immaculate Conception. "Mary is a child of Adam and by nature a child of wrath. Where then shall a refuge be found from her from the deluge of sin? The law of transmission is accomplished ere the soul has joined the body. And the cause of original sin, which comes to the body, is not a necessitating cause, for it remains in that body still after that baptism. It is that previous absence of grace from the soul which leaves her a prey to the corrupting flesh." Right? So he's making equivalent. Us after baptism, we still die and corrupt, but we don't have original sin anymore because we're baptized. And Mary, who was immaculately conceived, but still could die and has this corrupting body. It's a one-for-one comparison. And it's not a logically foolish comparison, right? We die because baptism only cleanses our souls, not our bodies. It's a workable idea. I totally disagree with it, but it's not that it's irrational. Mary in this system died just like we died. And as her baptism at conception did not cleanse her body, her sinful body, any more than our baptisms in the Holy Font cleanse our flesh so that we don't die. So it's this one-for-one equivalent. So understanding the Marian mortalist view, the Immaculate Conception really needs to be clarified. Mary was actively conceived with sin, but passively immaculately conceived. I'm going to repeat that. With the Marian mortalist view that the most Roman Catholics have, Mary was actively conceived of sin, but passively immaculately conceived. Now, the fact this even sounds blasphemous to most Roman Catholics shows you the kind of eternal schizophrenia that exists here, because it sounds impious, and the only reason that they have to accept this is because they accept a very defective anthropology, a heterodox and ahistorical anthropology. Now, let's unpack some of the problems of this anthropology. Now, I think you could make a scriptural argument for it. For example, in Romans 7, on the surface, it works with the flesh and the body death versus the mind. So you could say, yeah, Paul's mind, which is sinless, right? It's been regenerated in baptism. He's in Christ. still wars with the flesh and with the body of death. So just there, you could kind of make this scriptural argument, again, divorced from sacred tradition, but you can make the sola scriptura argument in favor of this mortalist immaculate conception view. But then you start having these strange bedfellows, because you don't have this argument ever made historically, but you do have the Gospel of Mary, a Gnostic source that teaches that all passions exist in the body, but the soul is not known or untainted by the body, right? The soul flees from these passions of the body because the soul, according to this gospel, had nothing to do with them, right? It just kind of lived with them for a time, but it's unstained and untainted by them. It's not known by them. And so in that sense, the Gnostics would see pretty much all souls as immaculately conceived, right? That as long as you escape from the body, your soul is pure and could do whatever Gnostic heaven is, right? But the Orthodox teaching is not dualistic. The Orthodox teaching has been clarified in response to this sort of dualism, right? And so it's kind of sad to see that the scholastics circled back to this dualistic, which anthropology that originated in Gnosticism. So let's unpack the scriptural and then sacred traditional argument in favor of the Orthodox view, why we cannot be Immaculate Conception mortalist for Orthodox. Now, the scriptures teach the soul who sins shall die. So it makes it pretty clear that souls die. It's not just bodies that have death. The son shall not bear the guilt of the father, nor the father bear the guilt of the son. The righteous of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself, right? So why does someone die? Because the soul who sins causes their own death, not the sin of their parents. That's the point. So if you look at Romans 7 in isolation, you would see that there's this dichotomy between soul and body, but that would be not hermeneutically and exegetically harmonized with Ezekiel chapter 18, where the death of soul and body are necessarily connected. Now, the question is, who's right? Now, we're going to see sacred tradition sides with the more plain Ezekiel 18 reading than the Romans 7 reading, which is fine, because some scriptures are clearer on certain questions than other scriptures. That's very common. We don't read the scriptures in isolation. We read them according to sacred tradition. Now, that being said, I don't think Ezekiel 18 is the only passage that really discusses this question, because we see the discussion of the tree of life in Genesis 3 and Revelation 21, right? If Adam and Eve continue eating from the tree of life, they would have been immortal. If in Revelation 21, those that are in heaven have the right to eat the tree of life. And so the interpretation we're going to see of sacred tradition is that by being obedient to God, that's equivalent to eating from the tree of life. That the tree of life is essentially a metaphor, though in the hagiographies there's an actual tree and actual fruit. But the point is, exegetically, is this metaphor, right? It's a type, right, for the obedience to God. And obedience to God, this cooperation with God's energies, allows us with our energies to be immortal, and that the lack of cooperation leads to degradation and death. Let me just turn my phone off here. And so is that a crazy interpretation, or do we find this in the fathers? Now, I'm going to be quoting here an article from myself, Original Sin in the Byzantine Dormition Narratives. It's on page 12. It's because there's just too many citations from St. Dionysius the Areopagite for me to unpack just in this passage. So if you want the citations, you can follow up there. Now, according to St. Dionysius the Areopagite, his teaching on life is that God's energies are distributed hierarchically from God to the highest rank of angels downwards. Such energies are the cause and origin and essence and life of all things, and even of those who fall away from God. This means God constantly sustains everything, because evil then is a privation of good. Turning from God causes death. Evil disconnects oneself from life source, akin to pulling a plug cuts off power. Pulling a plug is not a quotation from Dionysius. So St. Dionysius, who is an actual disciple of the apostles, takes for granted that life is sustained by the energies of God. Okay, so this is consistent with the idea of the soul that is obedient to God maintains its life. and that thereby the soul's living keeps the body living, and the soul's death leads to the body's death, right? That's the origin of this doctrine. And so for the authenticity de Nicene Corpus, simply you're going to have to deal with the academic articles that Evangelos Nikotopoulos has published and will continue to publish on this question. I will otherwise not accept a polemic like, oh, this is crazy and it's cope. You have the right to say that after you show that those articles are wrong, because they're not. And so that being said, St. Dionysius, this is a quote from him, says, evil qua being, evil makes no single essence or birth, but only as far as it can pollute and destroys the subsistence of good things existing. And even anger participates in the good, by the very movement and desire to direct and turn the seeming evils to the seeming good. And the very man who desires the very worst life, as wholly desirous of life, and that which seems best to him by the very fact of desiring and desiring life, and looking to a best life, participates in the good. And if you should entirely take away the good, there will be neither essence, nor life, nor yearning, nor movement, nor anything else. So that the fact that birth is born from destruction is not a power of evil, but a presence of a lesser good, even as disease is a defect of order, not total. For this should be, not even the disease itself will continue to exist, but disease remains and is. So again, just saying in more detail what we're already saying before, that Dionysius sees this connection between God maintaining everything and something totally divorced of God and his goodness would cease existing. Now, that being said, there's too much in his corpus to really unpack here, but he views physical death as intertwined with spiritual death because life is sustained by cooperation with God's energies or grace. And we're going to see this same idea of the saints. Now, St. Justin Martyr writes in Dialogue with Trypho, they, Adam and Eve, were made like God, free from suffering and death, provided they kept his commandments and were deemed deserving the name of his sons. So, right, how did they continue life? By obedience. Exactly the interpretation of Genesis 3 that I gave. We continue. Make sure I didn't go too far. All right. St. Gregory Nyssa and the Great Catechism. Now, the cause of this dissolution is evident. That's dissolution of the body. Since both soul and body have a common bond of fellowship in their participation of the sinful affections, there is also an analogy between the soul's and body's death. Whereas in regard to the flesh, we pronounce the separation of the sin and life to be death, so in respect of the soul, we call the departure of real life death. And elsewhere, St. Gregory Nyssa says, the participation in evil observable in both soul and body is of one and the same character. Humanity, once revolted through the malice of the enemy and brought into bondage to sin, was also alienated from the true life. So we see here put very plainly by St. Gregory Nyssa that disobedience is what alienates us from life. Again, that interpretation that I gave of Genesis 3, which what works that interpretation is that the actions of the soul determines the outcome of the body. Now, the Council of Carthage states this in its 109th canon, that whosoever says that Adam, the first man, was created mortal, so that whether he had sinned or not, he would have died in body, that is, he would have gone forth of the body, not because his sin merited this, but by natural necessity, let him be anathema. So they anathematize anyone who thinks death is a natural necessity, right? It's the result of disobedience from God, but it doesn't really get into that detail here, but we're going to look at the minutes of this council in just a moment. But I'll just point out, again, the anathema here. In the Old Testament, they anathematize people in the book of Deuteronomy. St. Paul anathematized people. The local councils anathematize people. The ecumenical councils anathematize people. The Orthodox Church still anathematizes people. They still issue anathema. It's the most recent send made in 1983. The Oriental Orthodox, the Roman Catholics, the Protestants, they don't anathematize people anymore. Who is still the church? Good question. Good question. So we continue. This is in the minutes of Council 419. The Bishop Aurelius said, my affirmation is that although Adam, as created in paradise, is said to have been made immortal at first, he afterwards became corruptible through transgressing the commandment. Right? So again, that interpretation of Genesis 3 that I gave, This is what informed the creation of the canon in Carthage. Now we have St. Maximus the Ambigua, and we're going to see as they start dealing with more profound anthropological heresies, particularly here, this would be monothelitism and monoenergism being the real problems in St. Maximus' day. You start getting much more specific statements that make very clear the connection of body and soul, right? That the death of the body is connected to the death of the soul. So here we start getting the more clarified statements, because there's not development in doctrine as it's new, but there is clarification in terminology where things get clearer in that sense. So St. Maximus writes, if instead of his wife he had entrusted God, right, Adam, and had been nourished from the tree of life, he would not have lost the gift of immortality, which is maintained perpetually through participation in life, i.e., obedience to God. First man fell away from divine life and embarked upon a different life, which engenders death, a life in which he acquired for himself an irrational form, right? So as we could see, the actions of the individual, right, the decisions of the soul, affect the body. It also affects the soul, by the way, because it becomes irrational. St. John of Damascus presumes upon this as well, being well read in Maximus. He writes, through all my creations, these are words for God, but elaborated poetically, you are to ascend to me, your creator, and of all the fruits you may pluck one, that is myself, who art the true life, right? God is the fruit of the tree of life here. Let everything bear for you the fruit of life, and let participation in me be the support of your own being, for in this way you will be immortal, right? Adam's immortality is by participating in the divine life in obedience to God. But of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat of it, for in the day that you eat thereof you shall surely die. You cannot remain incorruptible who partakes of sensible food. All right, so the disobedience here, and here would be the passions, because sensible food pertains to the appetites and the passions, that leads to death. Now, here we have Gregory Palamas. So we see who post-schism is preserving the unanimous teaching of the early church. Is it the Orthodox, or is it the scholastics and the popes that we read beforehand? We're going to see it's clearly the Orthodox. St. Gregory Palamas writes, the death of the soul is when God leaves the soul and is separated from it. Right? The very Dionysian of him, by the way. When the human soul is separated from the divine energy for good, it is not only smitten with inaction, but starts working against itself, sinking from bad to worse. The soul's state of death in due course brought about the death of the body too. Right? So explicit that the soul's death leads to the body's death. He, Satan, beguiled him, Adam, with deadly advice and made him share his own sin and spiritual deadness. Of necessity, bodily death followed the spiritual death. I'll repeat. Of necessity, bodily death followed the spiritual death. So the evil one caused our double death by his single death. Right? So it's not dualist like the Immaculate Conception mortalist. It is very much one for one. Death of soul means death of body. The Council of Yassi, a Pan-Orthodox Council, 1642, states, Adam had a perfect knowledge of God. Therefore, in knowing God, he knew all other things through God. By sinning, he came into a state of sin, and being expelled from paradise, he became subject to death. Presently, losing the perfection of his reason and understanding, his will became prone to evil rather than good. So as you can see, the state of sinning makes one subject to death. We see here in the Decree 6 of Jerusalem 1672, another Pan-Orthodox council, the idea that sin affects both body and soul. All right, so ancestral sin spread successfully to all posterity so that there is not a single one born according to the flesh who is free from that burden and who has not felt the consequence of the fall in this life. And by the burden and effect of the fall, we do not call acts of sin itself. For many forefathers, prophets, and other innumerable men, especially the Mother of God, Mother of God of the Word and the Virgin Mary, were unattached to these and other such sins, right? Like the idea that Job and Mary and Jeremiah and St. John the Baptist said they didn't commit sins themselves, right? But they still inherited original sin. But the inclination to sin and the calamities to which divine justice punished man for his disobedience, right? So they didn't do acts of sin, but they inherited the inclination to sin and the calamities with which divine justice punished man for his disobedience. All right? Such as exhausting labors, tribulations, bodily infirmities, diseases of birth, a hard life on earth up to a certain time, wandering or uncertainty, that's gnomic will. I won't pack it here, but right, it's this idea that not instantly knowing what's right, what's wrong, that's a fallen mind. And lastly, bodily death, right? So all these weaknesses of the body and minds and the inclination of sin are connected to bodily death. So we have this in our definition. This is settled for us. This is not an open question for Orthodox. Now, people could say, oh, you know, Orthodoxy in the 20th century reinvented itself. The Greeks are different. There's the Romanides, there's the Russians who are conservative, and all these other stereotypes. But I'm going to give three, might be the most popular writers from their respective traditions. And as we can see, they're all exactly on the same page on this question, because this is a settled question for us. St. Justin Popovich on original sin in his Dogmatics volume. Due to the close and direct connection of the soul with the body, original sin caused disorder in the body of our first parents. The consequences of the fall for the body were sickness, suffering, and death. All right, so the connection soul-body is what leads to death. So again, explicit in St. Justin Popovich. This is settled stuff for the Orthodox. In the Russian tradition, very big is Father Michael Pomazansky, particularly because he was actually educated in Imperial Russia, and he lived a very long time, and he was a very important professor at Jordanville. And so he writes the same. So this is not some like liberal Romanidian thing. This is something that's, again, popular because it's settled all around among the Orthodox. He writes, the physical consequences of the fall are diseases, hard labor, and death. These were the natural result of the moral fall. Right? As clear as you can make it. The falling away from communion with God, man's departure from God. Man became subject to the corrupt elements of the world in which dissolution and death are active. Man was created immortal in his soul, and he could have remained immortal also in body if he had not fallen away from God. The wisdom of Solomon says God did not make death. Right? So it makes it very clear, this idea that the reason we die is not because God just made some sort of punishment randomly. Oh, you're bad, then you all die and you inherit that death. But death is a disease that was started by Adam and Eve's wayward thinking. And we've inherited that wayward way of thinking and operating. Their tropos has been inherited. The way they personally operate. Human essence itself is uncorrupted. All right. Human essence itself is good. God did not make death. Through the devil, man called death upon himself. That's also quoting Wisdom of Solomon. So as we can see, the scriptures more easily square with the Orthodox view and with sacred tradition. So we continue. Metropolitan Hierothos Vlachos on original sin. Again, very important Greek theologian. So going the whole world to show this is what people in modern times, the Orthodox Church, have taught. Original sin was the deprivation of the glory of God, the estrangement from God, the loss of communion with God. This also had physical consequences. However, because the bodies of Adam and Eve, corruption and death entered. Just as when the root of a plant dies, the branches and the leaves become ill. So it happened with the fall of Adam. The whole human race became ill. The corruption and death which man inherits is the favorable climate of the cultivation of passions. And in this manner, the intellect of man is darkened. So again, the Orthodox teaching is settled. Dualist anthropology is just not possible. Body and soul are connected to original sin. Just like the scripture says, sin entered the world and death through sin, right? Not that like, you know, the body could die and the soul can't. It's just death into the world, sin into the world, and death through sin. Sin creates death. The soul and the body participate in this. They both die. All right. The only sinless death that's possible is voluntary, which is why in the Marian traditions of the Orthodox, the Theotokos dies voluntarily. The Lord himself also died voluntarily. And there's other saints having overcome sin that die voluntarily. This is something that finds its way in our hagiographies because we understand the connection between sin in the soul and bodily death. By the way, this is not just something I observe. This is something that scholars have observed. I forget the name of the book, but it's even a scholar on the Oriental Orthodox about the debates between Severus and Julian of Halicarnassus observes that the exact same teaching is what they presumed upon as well, because this was the universal teaching of the early church. Now, as for the Roman Catholics, the immortalist view is inconsistent with pre-schism consensus on the Dormition and is ahistorical, but it avoids dualism, right? So you could avoid a lot of problems by being like Father Christian Kops and just be a Marian immortalist, she never died, or being like Father Yugi, or and just believing she never died. The only problem with this is that it's not historical. No one believed this. It's lacking in the first 1,000 years of Christian history, besides the offhand comment of St. Epiphanius, where he says some we don't know. Some people think that she didn't die or something like that. But he says in a later paragraph that people thought she died. So it just seems maybe a polemical extreme that he's speculating about. But that being said, the consensus, because every single other source, is that Marian died, right? That not an immortalist view. But the Marian immortalist view, though doing violence to history, avoids the anthropological problems. The immortalist view is dualistic and problematic, right? For the reasons we already covered. So this I pose to the Roman Catholic apologist. Why is this unsettled for 2,000 years? I have heard such great things about the Roman Catholic Church and how their Pope could infallibly define things. And we can never be certain of anything. And the Protestants can never be certain of anything. But yet they don't know what really causes death. And this hasn't been settled, supposedly according to them, for 2,000 years. Well, it has been settled. It's been settled since the beginning. In the scriptures, by Saint Dionysius understood how it worked. We see this in Saint Justin Martyr. We see this in Gregory Nyssa. We see this in Maximus, the Damascene, Gregory Palamas, the Orthodox, Pan-Orthodox councils, on and on we go. We know what causes death. Sin causes death. Just to quote Romans 5:12. It's very simple. We don't need a Gnostic anthropology in order to make it all work, because we don't have any of these added ahistorical doctrines like the Immaculate Conception, because no one taught that either. Now, we're going to do some audience questions real soon. So guys, please pose those before we call it a day. But the infallibility problem for Roman Catholics could be summarized as so. If Roman Catholics are right, we either don't infallibly know what is infallible, right? Because they don't have fabulous ecumenical councils, they don't have fabulous executor statements, they don't have infallible definition of what's an infallible definition, right? So they don't have these things. Or only definitions are infallible, right? We'll just accept the interpretation Jimmy Akin gives, and clearly what Pope John Paul II, what Pope Pius XII, and obviously leaving open the Mary's death within the same document where he talks about her death, the idea that only definitions are infallible. But if only definitions are infallible, almost all important questions are still unanswered, right? Because we don't have many things meeting that criteria by any definition. Right? We have maybe two things, and we don't know for how long or how short they're defined, and so that leaves everything open to question. It's not been infallibly defined. We also find that it's ahistorical due to Vigilius, because he very explicitly so defined two opposite things. He broke the law of non-contradiction, and so that alone invalidates infallibility if we go by this what's left defined thing. All right, and again, it's sometimes the problems, like I remember this Most Holy Family Monastery video where it said that Satan leaves the defects of something in plain sight. And it's, I think, against the Protestants, this video. This is an example of that principle, right? In plain sight, this idea of papal infallibility is just wrong on its face. And not only just sounds ridiculous, it sounds silly. When properly and intelligently reflected upon and clarified, it's just plainly wrong and contradictory in history. It's just wrong in plain sight. It presently, Roman Catholic, it leads to huge anthropological uncertainty for Roman Catholics, because they don't have a definition for this, and so they can't define for themselves what causes death. And that would seem to be a pretty important detail that we would need to have settled. So that being said, before I start start the audience questions, I want to just remind people to go to orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate, or go to the PayPal link below, the Patreon link below, or the Venmo link below, whatever works best for you, to please support the missionary work in Cambodia. As I said before, we are translating the saint lives for every day of the year, so that way there's good devotional base of material for Cambodian Orthodox believers. And we need your support. It's $10 a day. So for $10, you cover the saint of the day. And I guess for the rest of history, because these things generally don't get retranslated very often, you'll be responsible for everyone being blessed by that saint's life in Khmer. And you would be very blessed, I'm sure, by God for that. All things during Lent, we should be taking the money we're saving from not eating certain things and giving alms. This is just one such thing. And so that is something I want to remind people of the work we're doing in Cambodia. We are also, we have opened a little, what do they call it? A chapel, more close to the downtown of the city. Parishioners donated a building, and we have donated icons. And we even have a parishioner who's a carpenter who's going to be making the wooden fixtures to hold the icons and all that. But we need a couple candle stands. It's for $120, 2 candle stands, $60, 1 candle stand. So please consider a donation to support the chapel there, so we have a functioning, nice-looking chapel. There's people there that have already donated a lot. Just need a couple candle stands because essentially they're working out of their poverty there to provide some of these things. So if you could provide that, that'd be very much appreciated. Again, orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate, or the PayPal link below, Venmo below, Patreon below. Please support the show by supporting the church in Cambodia. That's why I do this. And that's why I think the information you get here is the cross between what you would read in academia and peer-reviewed research and apologetics. It leaves you, I think, as informed as possible. And if you feel that this is so, please bless the Church of Cambodia, because that's why I do this. So, all right, let's do some audience questions. We have, can someone just relieve me of my free will having to be responsible for my choices? No. What kind of question is that, Michael? I don't get it. Can I join Opus Dei and still be Orthodox? I don't even know what Opus Dei is, actually. So, I don't know. I'm going to guess no. Not sure what it is. Bono says, they get around the epistemology by deferring to some future point where the corporate church will learn enough to answer it. But the problem with this is that there could be endless categorizations, right? Their whole methodology is just endless categorizations. It's not, how do we holistically look at sacred tradition and go by what people obviously meant? They look at something eisegetically to make it philosophically work with their later derivations from the truth. And so, that being said, right, Immaculate Conception to a normal reader would be body and soul, right? Because we believe at conception, the embryo, the zygote, has a soul. That's why the morning after pill is an evil thing. But Roman Catholic doctrine is actually not sure that, if they're going to be honest with themselves, because they believe that the soul could be sinless, but not the body, and that the soul is infused in the body, and there could be an interval of time where that's separated. It hasn't been infallibly defined otherwise. And so this leaves open abortion and all sorts of things, and the difference between active conception and passive conception, and we can make up even more categorizations if we want. And so it becomes nothing is certain. Let's just say Roman Catholicism is true, it's just not pragmatic. They pretend it's pragmatic, but it's on its face not pragmatic. You can never be epistemically certain of anything within the Roman Catholic system. Someone said this might be a bit off topic, yet his works were mentioned. Why do most scholars still believe Dionysus is not authentic? Sorry, I'm smiling because people that read scholarship are aware it takes a long time for things to marinate through scholarship. I do know that Archbishop Alexander Golitsyn is aware of it. And he said that, I think the word was excited. I won't get into details, any private correspondence, but that we should hear back what he feels about it. And, even if he doesn't agree, he's a man entitled to his opinions, of course. It shows that he's seriously interacting with this, right? So again, it's the Dionysian scholars are seriously interacting with this stuff. And so it takes time. So, because at first it's like, all right, let me consider this. And then they start realizing, wow, wait, there's hundreds of years of speculations about inauthenticity that are wrong. That doesn't change overnight. But with the technological change and academia, the EDU, who knows? Maybe in 10 years, we might see everyone flip on this question, God willing. Now we see this. Also, what did you mean that Mary died voluntarily? She wasn't subject to death. No, she overcame death. She was born subject to death. But when she attained to theosis, death was totally done in her. All right. During the Annunciation, she was pre-purified. And so she had no more taint of sin at the Annunciation. And so when the Lord indwelt in her, there was no taint of sin at all. We just don't mark that to her conception. We mark that to the Annunciation. And the scriptural tradition, well, scriptures talk about this, but the patristic tradition is very explicit and unanimous on this question. We have this: retreat and dissociate into some ad hoc distinction. And of course, this is a major problem with Roman Catholics, is the ad hoc distinctions that, if they're honest themselves, they're not really dealing with the context of the historical documents. I challenge, let's say, Eric Ybarra. He likes to have a long, good, drawn-out conversation. Let's have a long, drawn-out conversation with who is being more honest and more, I'd say, true to the original intent of these documents, right? And how they were understood to the people at the time. And I can't see anyone could say Vatican I after doing that. It's just not possible. It's in such an unhealthy and dishonest methodology. Again, I'm going to quote Michael Lofton. They shoot the arrow and then they paint the target around it, right? They prove their own doctrine by choosing the doctrine, and then they start figuring out how they're going to make it work, right? That's why they have to have these endless categorizations, all right? And it looks like that's all our questions for today. So I really appreciate your time in watching this. I hope you appreciate that papal infallibility is problematic because it doesn't work. It leads to epistemic problems. It doesn't answer questions that the Roman Catholics have, very important questions like what causes death unsettled. And that essentially they back themselves into a corner by divorcing themselves from reading things contextually and holistically and in line with sacred tradition. It leads to just a broken epistemic system. That's why Roman Catholicism and papal infallibility is broken. So blessed Lent, as we see, and I'll end the show by, as I end all of them, by quoting Jesus' rock: fight to death for the truth. The Lord God will fight for you. God bless you. Have a great day.